The next item on our agenda is the Evolving Biomedical Digital Environment, and we are joined today by three esteemed MDs. Bill Hanson from Penn Medicine, Benoit Desjardins, also from Penn Medicine, Associate Professor of Radiology at Penn, and James Balshi, CMIO at St. Luke's University Health Network. I forgot to mention Bill's also CMIO as well. So, gentlemen, with that, over to you. And let me hand the mic and mouse to Benoit.
Thank you very much, Richard. So thank you very much for inviting us. I think this is a very important topic, and getting a physician's point of view is important to put, to increase the kind of general knowledge of the audience on the specific topic we're going to cover. I'm going to start with a few slides. So our topic is the evolving biomedical digital environment. So we're talking about the evolution of digitization, the surge in medical devices, and the need for proper technology management. So we're three MDs, and we're going to give you our perspective. So the first one is Dr. James Balshi. Can you say a little bit about yourself, Jim?
Sure. I did my training at the University of Pennsylvania, so I knew Bill while I was there, and some vascular fellowship at Boston University. I was involved in IT throughout my professional career, on the periphery as an advisor. And after 3 decades of vascular surgery, I transitioned into the Chief Medical Information Officer role as we brought our 12 hospital Epic system onto about 300 ambulatory sites. We have 15,000 employees and about 1,500 employed providers. I have been involved in not only the telehealth expansion, particularly with the COVID crisis, but also in general, using our telehealth capabilities to cover our 12 hospitals for our specialty care, and our interest in predictive analytics using the Epic platform, as well as some other endeavors with Kensai and Salutary to improve our clinical decision support. And we're excited to be here today and talk about the challenges of technology in healthcare.
Thank you, Jim. The next panelist is Dr. William Hanson. He's from Penn Medicine. Can you introduce yourself, Bill?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Jim. Jim and I worked together when I was a medical student. He was a resident at Penn way back. I think neither of us realized we would be headed into colliding pathways, but we're both, for those of you that don't know what a CMIO is, it's typically a physician who straddles the IT world and the clinical community, translating back and forth requirements, interpretations, reality testing. Sometimes the IT people think that the doctor should just do it, and they don't have any idea of the impact on the physicians, and sometimes the physicians or nurses or respiratory therapists think the IT people should just be able to make something happen and don't really understand the limitations of the electronic medical record or the technology. So that's sort of the job that we live in. I trained as an internist and then as an anesthesiologist and went into critical care. Critical care exposes those of us who work in that area, as does the operating room, to a lot of machines and data flowing around us. And historically, that data was not well organized or well used in the practice of medicine. It was transcribed onto paper and filed away in a loose leaf binder someplace. As electronic medical records have proliferated, we've gotten better at taking data from those machines and from the electronic medical record to use it in a variety of ways. And some of that's predictive analytics. Some of that is decision support. There are hidden messages in waveforms. And Jim and I have both sat now in the last several months on an explosion in telemedicine as we've been forced to rethink the way we practice, trying to keep patients off campus to prevent them from being infected or from infecting more vulnerable patients. So it's been a very rapid growth in telemedicine. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I think that's all I want to say, Benoit, at this point.
Thank you very much, Bill. So I'm Bernardo Chard. I'm an academic radiologist at the same institution as Bill. My background is in artificial intelligence and mathematics. I'm also an NIH-funded investigator in cardiovascular imaging. I've played a lot of important roles in IT in my department. I also have an extensive expertise in cybersecurity with a few certifications. I've been working very closely with the cybersecurity team at Penn to try to protect radiology and other departments. So what is the evolving biomedical digital environment? Well, what's going on is that for the first time in history, we can actually digitize human beings. So we can digitize physiology, we can digitize biology, we can digitize anatomy, and we can put all of the stuff together in an electronic health record. And that combined with advances with the internet, mobile connectivity, social networking, and computational power has led to this massive growth in digital health, which we have to deal with these days. So physiology, typically we're dealing with sensors that can continuously measure every feature in the body, like the heart rate or the blood pressure, and are helpful to manage chronic disease. They often come in wearable format and wireless, and eventually they'll be embedded as nanosensors, and they generate like a ton of data. And there's many challenges with that in terms of data flooding, security and privacy, clinical validation, cost, and adoption into practice. Another aspect is biology. I mean, the genome has been sequenced in the early 2000s. That's the list of the genetic code that make us who we are. There's a lot of commonality between different human beings, but there's also differences. And these differences are important because they make us look like we look like, and also they make us susceptible to certain diseases that other people are not. And by knowing this genetic makeup, you can actually help cure those diseases or deal with those diseases. And there's an associated field called proteomics, which deals with proteins, which are molecules that handle a lot of the stuff in the body. And there's been a lot of work in sequencing proteins, determining their 3D structure and activity, interactions between protein. And that's important because these proteins are biomarkers of diseases and can help determine new drugs to treat disease. Another aspect is imaging. Imaging is my field. We can now image any part of the body. And we have tons of imaging devices that range from tiny little pills, little pill-sized camera that you can swallow, and they basically image the digestive tract as they transit through the body, all the way to MRI and CT scanners, which are much more difficult to swallow, but generate fantastic images. There's many negative aspects of all this imaging. One of them is a lot of imaging deals with radiation, and radiation causes cancer. It's estimated that CT scanning causes about 2% of all cancers in the United States. So it's a big thing. And many devices don't use ionizing radiation, but involve other risks. And that's an example of the kind of imaging devices that we have in our department, tons of them, as well as a bunch of other devices to take care of patients. So big numbers, and that's like the typical big academic institution. So that's a lot of stuff you take care of. And then we have to deal with the electronic health record. So this patient data is captured by several means: sensors, devices, multiple tests that generates huge data sets, terabytes of information per patient. And so we need to store that information somewhere and organize it. And that's done in medical databases that are huge. And the HITech Act in February 2009, mandated some changes to accelerate the adoption of electronic health record. And these, is basically systems can improve care and can allow patients to control their own health information. But there's several problems, such as manually entering all this information in the databases, a lot of problems in interoperability between the different devices because of the fragmentation of the US healthcare system, and then issues of privacy and security. So one of the main goals here is to reach personalized medicine. I mean, in the past, medicine was evidence-based, and it was shaped by guidelines indexed to populations, not to individuals, and relied on median, average types of people, and, statistics on who gets that, who gets this disease, which therapy works on this patient, but it was not really tailored to the individual. In the future, we are aiming towards a more like a personal data-based medicine that will involve individual features of, different patients. These features will be anchored to the individual, and all the care will be tailored to the individual patient, not really general therapy, but therapy tailored to this specific patient. And so there's a lot of problems dealing with this digital environment, data privacy, security, and the question is, whether this amount of data is going to help or whether it's going to be a hindrance, and how to manage so much data. So what I'm going to try to cover in this panel is, this data explosion for digital humans, a couple of practical examples, and how to manage this data. And then if we have time, we'll cover a couple of specialized topics such as medical devices, telehealth, and artificial intelligence. So that's it for the intro slides. And so we will spend the next 40 minutes or so to discuss several aspects of the biomedical digital environment, its positive aspects and its negative aspects. But before we do that, let's try to identify what are the main concerns for each of you. Can you tell me what are your top 4 problems in dealing with this evolving biomedical digital environment? Let's start with you, Jim.
Sure. So currently, the telehealth and the response of telehealth in managing the pandemic, not only for patient care, but also for health delivery system care. We were dramatically impacted from a financial standpoint by the shelter in place and the fear of many patients for attending a in-office visit, as well as the reduction in scheduled elective surgeries that were mandated by the government. After that, we are trying to get our head around how is this EMR or EHR going to play into the delivery of care over the next 30 years. It's certainly in its maybe teenage years in terms of evolution, but we know that it's not the solution, it's not the best thing. Sometimes it's a barrier to healthcare. And then with this tsunami of medical devices that have fallen upon healthcare, maintaining security and privacy is a concern that we deal with every day. And lastly, the promise of artificial intelligence and machine learning is really going to depend on how can we handle not just big data, but massive data. As Benoit was mentioning, the genome is huge into itself, and as more and more patients have genomic information stored in their medical record, on top of all the imaging that's occurring, this is becoming a daunting concern as to where does that data live and how can we manage it. And I just look at it from the standpoint of my granddaughter, who is going to be 1. She has the potential of eventually having 90, 95 years of information in a digital file. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jim. What about you, Bill? What are your top 4 problems in dealing with this evolving biomedical digital environment?
Well, I think Jim and I are going to have overlapping sets of problems. So I'm going to add a couple other ones that Jim hasn't spoken about. Certainly, one of the problems that we were preoccupied with in the 1.5 to 2 years prior to the pandemic was workforce burnout. This is doctors in particular, but really any clinician, many of whom grew up with paper records and had a way of working with paper records, writing their notes down, converting to working with electronic medical record on the backdrop of a number of other stressors in their professional lives in terms of seeing more patients, working longer hours, trying to have some sort of a life-work balance. And the culprit in many cases that people pointed at for this burnout issue was the electronic medical record. There are two major medical record vendors in the United States and then a bunch of smaller ones. Neither of them fared particularly well in evaluations of their usefulness. Their critiques have been leveled that they're designed for administrative functions and not for workflow efficiency. So that had been a big problem that suddenly poof went away when the pandemic arrived, and much bigger concerns presented themselves with the onset of telemedicine, as Jim mentioned. Interestingly, as with all disasters, we saw an uprising or an upwelling of cybersecurity threats during the pandemic, vulnerable people working quickly, and hospitals and patient medical data turned out to be very lucrative targets for bad actors. So one type of hack would be looking for large data sets, and another that's been increasingly prevalent is attacks on a system where the hospital's critical systems are taken down, and there are ransomware attacks. So we're under constant threat from across the world, frankly. We see attacks of one sort or another from every point of the compass, and sometimes the attack is routed through some point in the compass that isn't the originating source of it. A third area that I think we care about, Jim mentioned that his daughter is going to have a longitudinal record of hopefully 80 to 100 years, God bless her. The quality of that data right now is adequate, but one would suspect that the quality will improve, and therefore the fidelity of the information and the usefulness of the information will improve. Right now we do a lot of natural language processing, but medical language is very hard to parse properly. And then finally, as we deal with genomic data and proteomic data, the stuff that Benoit mentioned, those are all permanent records. They're not like a credit card you can throw away and get a new one. So we care about the privacy of that information, and then just knowing what the interpretation of a genetic finding is. That's a constantly evolving field. Something that was not felt to be important a year ago may become very important for determinants of health going forward. So these are all areas that we think about in interfacing between information technology and clinical care.
Thank you, Bill. So let's talk about the different aspects of this data explosion for digitizing humans. So in my slides, I talk about digitizing physiology, biology, anatomy, and the electronic health record. Let's talk about the different problems related to each of those. First, physiology. So we have a ton of sensors available to measure and record different aspects of human physiology. A lot of modern sensors are wearable and can stay on the patient 24/7 and continuously monitor their physiology. What issues do you see with wearables and other sensors and the massive amount of data they generate?
So I think I have the first bullet point here, and I'll answer that. I would bet a good maybe 2/3 of the audience is wearing some sort of a digital watch at this point. And digital watches have increasingly adopted, as have frankly cellular phones, sensors that can be used for informing medical decisions and the like. And Apple, as with Fitbit and some of the other vendors, Withings, have all thought it'd be just great to dump a continuous stream of this information towards the doctor, and the doctor will know what to do with that. That's not the way it works. And we need, in our brief 15-minute encounter with the patient, to have a digest that's got actionable information that's been pre-digested. That interface between raw data and digestible information hasn't really been developed to any sophisticated degree yet. Although we are seeing, and I would say that looking at Apple's trajectory here, they're getting more and more useful data to the consumer, who can then bring it to their provider. But you think about things like weight, respiratory rate, EKG, diabetic records, all of those things can be accumulated now and brought to the clinical encounter in a way that was never the case before. And the clinical community isn't necessarily as ready as the technology community to handle that data. So there's sort of a reckoning that needs to occur between the clinicians and the technology innovators. And we see a proliferation of people providing clever data that is not integrated coherently in a way that a doctor can think about things. So how does the EKG relate to the weight and the blood pressure? So you have the problem of any one single stream, and then you have the problem of integrating two or more of those streams. So I'll stop there and let Jim take on the next bullet point.
Well, that's a great segue, because you really were describing a lot of what we're seeing in the ambulatory space, while at the same time we're actually looking at increasing some of that data flow on the inpatient or acute care space with real-time vital signs feeding some of our predictive analytics models. And the difficulty, of course, with all of that flow of data is it real? Is it valuable? And building algorithms that help us determine the oxygen saturation dropped to 0 because the probe fell off the finger is a lot different than when we see a trending down over time. But we're trying to move from our historic era of monitoring a patient once a shift with vital signs to maybe twice a shift, more toward what Bill's career was in anesthesia, where they were monitoring a patient continuously during their operations, and bringing that, sort of bridging that out into the hospital space, where we have a more continuous flow of information that might identify patients who are deteriorating or going towards septic shock or cardiogenic shock. And so balancing that increasing flow of data to make more timely decisions with getting overloaded with junk data is really a challenge. And then the other area around the physiology is, as we talked about earlier, the security of that data. I grew up paying attention to some of the more arcane things in the news cycle back when Stuxnet happened. And for those of you, I'm sure most of you know what that was, but the NSA embedded malware into chips that got distributed widely across the globe until one of them got connected to the Iranian centrifuges. And that was able to corrupt the Iranian nuclear program. And looking at the logistics and supply chain of many of our devices, there are hundreds of vendors, and we just don't have confidence that all of these devices are secure and safe for protecting our patients' information. So it's a challenge.
Thank you. The next area is biology, with genomic and proteomic data defining individuals down to their own and unique genetic code. What are your main concerns on these matters?
Yeah, so I mentioned this in one of the earlier bullet points. The amount of this data and the increasingly inexpensive acquisition of the data has led to a proliferation of genetic assays, and the information about their significance is constantly being updated. And so somebody may submit their genetic material for either a tumor genome or their own whole body genome, and have essentially a library where 2 or 3 books in that library have intelligible information in it. And the vast bulk of the The rest of the library is as of yet untranslatable because we don't have the Rosetta Stone to make the translation between the genetic material and what it means for the human, or the tumor material and what it means for the human. That information is constantly being updated. So you may submit a genetic sample for a single question, but the answers to a bunch of other questions that are significant come along later. And there's an issue of, are we responsible for telling you, hey, you got this test 5 years ago. We just learned that you have a lethal mutation on one of your genes, and good luck with that. No longer a patient of ours, move someplace else. How do we find that patient? We had a transient relationship. These are all sort of some of the issues that we deal with. Another example is, I'm a general internist, and I train to deal with a certain bulk of information, and around me is growing up this library of new information that I can't keep track of. It's not really my bailiwick. So if I send some information, the geneticist would say, well, how do we give the information back about the significance of this in a way that the doctor can translate it to the patient with confidence? Or do we send that patient to a genetic counselor? These are all sort of the issues that come along with genetic information, aside from the ones that, you can't alter your genome. So you can't throw away like a credit card. Your genome is your genome. And some of the hackers are out there trying to get genetic information, which is a permanent record of you.
Excellent. So the next topic is going to be anatomy and imaging, which is my field. So there's been a massive explosion in imaging data to characterize all aspects of the body. As radiologists, we have to interpret ever increasing amounts of imaging data. A simple CT scan involved about 70 images when I started. Now they involve up to 5,000 images. And not only do we read larger imaging studies, but we read more and more imaging studies every day, leading to significant burnout in the field. We also need to store this imaging data somewhere. In our radiology department, we generate about 400 gigabytes of compressed imaging data every day, and about 130 terabytes of compressed data every year. And this number increases every year, annual number increases. Our imaging database currently involves almost a petabyte of imaging data. That's a lot of information. We not only need to store this large amount of data, but we also need to access it instantly as needed. This involves important challenges in data storage and data retrieval. What about you, Jim? You're dealing with imaging data in other fields, correct?
Yeah. In fact, I had a conversation this morning with the administrator for our surgical services line, and I was informing her that our biomedical engineering department was facing a challenge right now at one of our campuses where the bariatric surgeons are intent on recording their surgical procedures in video. And we're doing upwards of 500 or 600 bariatric procedures a year, and that's a sizable amount of video just for one subspecialty, where the amount of storage space is huge. And right now we're struggling with, where do we put that? And clearly, the cloud offers us some sort of relief in that we can upload, but cloud storage is not cheap, and that's an expensive component of an evolving, not just an ask, but there is a value to some of the imaging technology outside of radiology that is clinically very helpful, and we haven't had to deal with this before, and it's certainly exploding at a rate that we're really challenged with balancing the cost of that data storage and the details of how you get that data into a system and where you keep it. It's a challenge, and we have a fairly sophisticated IT department in our institution, but many hospitals are really struggling with this today.
Thank you. So the next and probably one of the biggest problems is dealing with the electronic medical record. This contains all the relevant medical information about patients, including recorded physiology data. physicians now spend about a third or more of their time entering patient clinical data in these huge databases. What are the main problems you perceive with the electronic medical record and the management of this massive amount of the clinical data that physicians must enter every day in this monster of a database?
Yeah, it's Bill. I'm going to ask Jim to use his analogy here, which I think is very apt. And then maybe I'll segue from that.
Sure. You know, the electronic medical record evolved both because of a need and because of the healthcare or the HITECH Act. And it's not something that the medical profession was really prepared for, and that is a shared medical record. When Bill and I both started in practice, everybody had their own medical record in their office, and you sent letters back and forth. But today, if we took care of Benoit as a patient, both of us would have access to the same record. And in fact, 10 other specialists do. And so it's evolved into what we like to refer to as the public restroom. Everybody loves to use it, and it's very convenient, and it has real value, but nobody wants to clean it. And it's a very big challenge today to really get a curated, accurate medical record with good data and not a lot of extra stuff that sometimes is inaccurate.
Yeah, and let me elaborate on that a little bit. So again, going back to when Jim and I first started working, my father was a general internist at Penn, and he would sit with a patient, write down his notes on an index card with a fountain pen, go home on the weekends, listen to the baseball game, transcribe or dictate his notes into a dictaphone. They would be transcribed onto onion skin paper, filed in a filing cabinet, and that was his record of the patient, the way he liked it, the way he could go back and find the information. It was organized in a way that he thought about it. And you know, we all have our own bedrooms, we all have our own houses, everybody has their own way of storing stuff, and we're all now living in a giant dormitory. So everybody's sharing the same bedroom, sharing the same bathroom, sharing the same shower. Translated into realistic terms, we have things like the problem list, which is, what are the problems that I've seen this patient for? And the internist has a way of thinking about problem lists. It's very different from a surgeon. And the expectation is that each successive doctor that sees a patient will clean up the problem list, getting rid of the things that are no longer accurate and updating with their own. And people, A, don't want to do that, and B, don't feel I'm competent as a vascular surgeon like Jim, reconciling so-and-so's rheumatologic record with their arthritis, or vice versa. So that's a group of people living in the same dormitory, and now we've extended the possibility to say, well, if you're all on an Epic electronic medical records, one of the two big vendors I mentioned, we're going to help you out. We're going to give you the problems from the other places that this guy has seen that are in Epic. So now I don't only have to reconcile Jim's situation with my situations. I got to look at the stuff that came from the hospital next door and the hospital down the street. Many patients visit 3, 4, 5 hospitals in the course of any given 2 or 3 year period for different reasons. And this is all felt to be to the good by the EMR vendors. We've done this great new thing for you, but really the recipients, the providers that are working with this is also true for medications, for allergies, for a number of other things, feel like this is sort of this massive unintended consequence of these electronic medical records. So it's a complicated world. We haven't figured that out yet. I think the vendors are beginning to realize that what they once thought was good was maybe not so good. It may be that artificial intelligence has a way of helping us with doing some of this automatically, but we're a decade behind many other industries in terms of the workflow as it integrates with the software, as it integrates with the data and the technology.
Thank you. So let's move to the next topic. So how do we practically manage so much data? We have to consider a continuous increase in the adoption, the infrastructure requirement, and the interoperability. So let's start with the continuous increase in adoption of digital medicine. What are problems related to that?
well, I guess I've got a couple things here. I mentioned Apple, and Apple is a convenient, commonly understood starting point. I have a health app on my my watch and my iPhone, and it will integrate with other devices. And I mentioned that Apple has several tools, Health Kit, Research Kit, that allow practices or devices to interact with the provider. So you can consume data from outside the walls of the hospital and provide them inside the walls of the hospital. Initially it was raw data, now it's more digested. But as an example, let's just say a patient develops or appears to have, Jim mentioned the pulse ox goes to 0, meaning that there's 0 oxygen in the blood of the patient. Or the blood pressure goes to 250 over 150, which we would all say is pretty bad. Who's responsible for responding to that? In what time period? How do we ensure the fidelity of that information? Could have dropped off a finger. It could be that somebody's jumping on the blood pressure cuff of the patient. How do we even know that the patient themselves is wearing the device that's being used to consume the data? These are all challenges that we deal with. And we ultimately need to get to something that is a commonly agreed. This is something that we, the doctors, you, the patients, and the malpractice lawyers all agree are an appropriate view of the world, because a malpractice lawyer doesn't really care so much if I say I'm not responsible for looking at it at 11 o'clock at night when the blood pressure is 250 over 150, if they can demonstrate that the patient had a bad outcome. Same thing goes with, Benoit mentioned all this radiographic information. There may be a lesion that was barely visible 5 years ago and then becomes actionable 5 years later. The malpractice lawyer will go back and say, no, look, here, I've got an expert that says they could see it 5 years ago. Then you're liable for that. And then the other issue that goes with that is to the degree to, if you compress an image, you lose resolution. And the same thing goes on with some of these other issues. So there are a lot of complicated issues with this sort of automatic increase in data around us, the realistic interpretation of that data. Who does it? Is it a human? Is it an AI? Is it a combination of a human and an AI? These are some of the problems we grapple with.
What about the problems related to the infrastructure requirements to handle this massive amount of data?
Well, I think that we definitely are struggling with data parks versus cloud storage of our electronic medical records and our PACS systems and our vendor neutral archives. So will the cloud architecture allow us to continue to grow the amount of data that healthcare grows, monumentally, and potentially at a greater rate than other industries that are taking advantage of the cloud? So I do a lot of work with Microsoft, and I know that they're very concerned about the security of their cloud, but also the location of the cloud storage centers impacts the efficiency of our electronic medical record. I can give you a case in point. Epic has a very specific requirement for response time on your data infrastructure, on your architecture. So if your response time starts to creep up, where you click on something and it takes 0.2 seconds, you don't qualify for an Epic installation. Well, when we go to the cloud, unless we have data centers every 50 miles, we're going to start to see lag times, latencies that are going to impact the efficiency of our systems. The speed of light is finite, so we're stuck with some of these very, very tenuous physical requirements that are going to be stress the ability for us to manage these massive amounts of data.
Anything, Bill, to say about that?
Well, I mean, the only thing I'd add to it is that when I started in this role about 10 years ago, cloud was the dark side. Health IT professionals didn't believe the cloud was a safe place. And you know, as with every other naysayer, we as an industry have moved to the cloud. We're super concerned about having redundant copies of our electronic medical record. I mean, we at Penn had a period during one of the hurricanes where our primary data center lost power, and we were out for 2 or 3 days, and that, you know, for us was a bad thing that kind of crippled us for that period of time. That same hurricane hit hospitals in New York where they had their servers in the basement and crippled the hospital for over a year or longer. So, you know, this isn't any different from a bank, but so we're very concerned about resiliency, having multiple pathways for information. And, you know, increasingly we're taxing the bandwidth of our Wi-Fi systems, of our infrastructure systems, et cetera. So, I mean, all the things that you professionals that are listening to us think about are very much in play for us. And it's a, you know, it's a super, it's a major front of mind concern for our IT leaders and our trustees.
Thank you. I think we have time for like one last topic. And so out of those that are left, I'm going to pick one. Teleradiology. It's a very important topic in the middle of this.
That's selfish, Benoit.
Well, it's very important. And, you know, before the pandemic at our institution, we did about 25 video medical consultations per day, which was more like the exception than the rule. During the pandemic, this has jumped to 7,000 medical video consultation per day. It's about like 300 times more than just a few months ago. What are the main practical implications of this massive recent jump in telehealth?
James?
Well, access from on the patient side, I think is the primary issue. Although we believe that there is omnipresence of smartphones and smart devices and computers for everyone, not everyone has capability for telehealth. Although it certainly provides us with tremendous assets that we didn't realize prior to the pandemic. You know, Pennsylvania is one of the 20 states that does not have payment parity, so that there was no real financial role for telehealth on a large scale in Pennsylvania, and we've been able to overcome that because of the pandemic public health emergency waiving all of those payer requirements. So it's a tremendous stressor on health systems to be able to maintain that now that patients have realized I can have a televisit with my provider and I don't have to get my son to take off from work to drive me to the doctor's office. And that this is going to change the culture of the way we deliver healthcare, but it has to be married to an economic reality that allows us to provide that and still survive at a level that America has gotten comfortable with.
Any words about that, Bill?
Yeah, you know, it was a fascinating period. We had a lot of infrastructure in place, but we, as Benoit said, we were doing 50 to 100 visits per month in a lot of practices, and we went in the course of about 2 or 3 short weeks at the beginning of March to 7,000 a day. We had to educate our workforce. We had to educate our patients. We had to figure out the billing, the legal requirements, practicing medicine across state lines. Very, very complicated ramp up. And now we're in a phase where patients are coming back to the hospital, waiting in long queues to get into the parking lot, waiting for elevators that are now socially distant. So we're seeing all of that inefficiency creep back in, but people are reverting to the old ways because of the financial issues that Jim just mentioned. We need to find the right balance between the things that can safely, efficiently, and productively be done using a televisit with those things like surgery or surgical endoscopy or, you know, other things that need to be done with a face-to-face encounter. And I suspect we overshot on both ends, and we'll get back to some equilibration. I do believe that medicine has been, like so many other things, forever changed by this pandemic. So we're in a continuously escalating learning curve right now.
Well, thank you, Jim and Bill. I think we could go on for hours talking about many other aspects of, you know, digitizing healthcare and digital medicine, but our time is kind of up at this point. So thank you for this fascinating discussion.
And thank you, Benoit, for leading a great panel with some wonderful insights. So I learned something here today, gentlemen. Thank you for sharing.
Our pleasure.